Berlin, April 30th, 1945. Hitler is dead in his bunker, but the war above ground refuses to end. A city of ruins is still fighting. For a single building, most of its defenders will never live to see fall. Boys of 15 with rifles too heavy for them. Old men in Volkssturm coats. SS fanatics with nothing left to lose. In the next 48 hours, thousands will die for one address on a burning map: the Reichstag. By the last week of April, Berlin was no longer a functioning capital. It was a maze of rubble, craters, and burned-out trams, cut off district by district as Soviet forces closed in from every direction. The Third Soviet Shock Army had already punched through the northern suburbs. The German High Command, desperate and out of options, threw whoever remained into the fight: regular troops, exhausted reservists, and civilians with almost no military training at all. Volkssturm units, Germany's last resort home guard, were armed mostly with Panzerfausts and told to hold the roads leading into the government quarter. Many of these men had received only a few hours of instruction before being sent to the front line. Their orders were simple to state and nearly impossible to carry out: stop the advancing Red Army before it reached the symbolic heart of the collapsing Reich. Anti-aircraft guns, originally built to bring down Allied bombers, were dragged off their rooftop platforms and aimed horizontally straight at Soviet tanks rolling through the streets below. It was a desperate improvisation born of necessity. Flak crews who had never once fired at a ground target now found themselves defending intersections and boulevards as the last functioning artillery left in the city's center. Along the waterways threading through the city, more flak positions dug in among the reeds and rubble, watched by small groups of civilians who had nowhere left to hide. Fighting had moved so close to residential streets that ordinary Berliners could watch battles unfold from their own windows. For many of them, a war that had once felt distant on radio broadcasts was now arriving violently at their own front doors. The Reichstag building itself had stood empty and fire-damaged since the infamous 1933 arson that helped bring Hitler to power. It held no real military value in 1945, yet Joseph Stalin had personally designated it as the ultimate symbolic prize of the entire Berlin operation: the one building. Soviet propaganda needed to show, conquered on film, whatever the cost in soldiers' lives to take it. On April 29th, Soviet forces of the Third Shock Army launched their final push toward the building, crossing the heavily defended Maltka Bridge under relentless machine gun and artillery fire. German defenders had flooded low-lying areas nearby and turned the bridge approach into a narrow killing ground. Soviet losses in those first hours were staggering, but the advance did not stop. Kral Opera House became another fortified strongpoint in the German defensive line. SS troops, French volunteers of the Charlemagne Division, and scattered remnants of regular army units fought from its wrecked interior. Many of these men had nothing to return to and refused every chance to surrender, choosing instead to fight inside a burning building until they were killed or overrun. Soviet artillery batteries moved close enough to fire directly into buildings rather than lobbing shells over them from a distance. Guns were wheeled to point-blank range, sometimes just meters from their targets. In these final days of the battle, the distance separating attacker from defender in the government district often shrank to less than 100 meters, turning almost every street into a private battlefield. By nightfall, entire blocks around the Reichstag were burning uncontrolled, lighting the sky orange over silhouettes of gutted buildings. Smoke mixed with dust from collapsing walls made it nearly impossible to see more than a few meters ahead. Soldiers on both sides described fighting almost blind, guided only by the sound of gunfire and the glow of fires reflected off broken windows and shattered stone. Inside the Reichstag itself, once Soviet troops breached the entrance, the interior corridors became a maze of brutal close-quarters combat. German soldiers fought room to room and floor to floor, refusing to give up a building that had been little more than a burned-out shell for over a decade. Grenades were thrown blindly around corners, and entire rooms changed hands multiple times within hours. Meanwhile, across the rest of the government district, the fighting was just as merciless. Bunkers, subway tunnels, and shattered ministry buildings became isolated strongpoints, each one requiring its own costly assault. Neither side showed much willingness to take prisoners in the chaos, and communication between German units had largely broken down, leaving many small groups to fight entirely on their own. Civilians who had survived the bombing raids of previous years now faced house-to-house combat in what remained of their neighborhoods. Water lines were destroyed, forcing people to collect water from craters and broken pipes in the open, often under fire. Basements that had served as bomb shelters became overcrowded refuges, packed with families waiting out a battle they had no way to escape. By the night of April 30th, after brutal fighting up the main staircase, Soviet troops finally reached the upper floors of the Reichstag. Two young sergeants, Mikhail Yegorov and Meliton Kantaria, carried a red banner through smoke and gunfire to raise it over the roof, the image Soviet propaganda had been waiting for since the offensive began, staged and restaged for the cameras in the days that followed. The flag going up did not mean the fighting was over. German troops still held parts of the building's basement and lower floors, and combat continued inside the Reichstag for nearly 2 more days. Soviet soldiers celebrating above ground could still hear gunfire echoing up through the stairwells beneath them, a grim reminder that victory and death were happening in the very same building at once. On May 1st, following Joseph Goebbels' suicide inside the Fear Bunker, Weidling made contact with Soviet General Vasily Chukov to discuss the city's fate. Chukov demanded nothing less than the complete, unconditional surrender of the entire Berlin garrison. There would be no negotiated ceasefire, no partial terms, and no room left for further delay in ending the fighting. In the early hours of May 2nd, inside a modest ground-floor flat in Tempelhof, Weidling signed the formal surrender order for the city of Berlin. His written statement to the remaining troops was blunt and direct. Hitler had abandoned his soldiers through suicide, and continuing to fight for a leader who was already dead served no purpose left in this war. Loudspeaker trucks broadcast the surrender order across the smoking ruins of the city that morning. German soldiers, many of whom had spent their final days fighting for a cause they knew was already lost, began laying down their weapons in the very streets and squares they had died trying to defend just hours earlier, ending organized resistance across most of central Berlin. An estimated 134,000 German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity that day, filing past the ruins of a capital that no longer resembled the city it had been. Weidling himself was taken to Moscow, interrogated for years, and eventually sentenced to 25 years in prison. He would die in Soviet custody a decade later, one of the last commanders of a battle fought entirely for a symbol.